What if I told you that if a guy is doing these 9 little things, you're on his mind much more than you realize, and he's hiding it on purpose, and there's a reason for that? Most people completely misunderstand how this works. Here's the surprising part. When you're truly stuck in a guy's thoughts, when he honestly can't stop thinking about you, he often doesn't act more interested. He doesn't suddenly text all day. He doesn't become extra romantic overnight. In many cases, he does the opposite. He acts completely normal, like everything is casual, like you're just another person he enjoys spending time with. Here's something almost nobody talks about. The guy who's thinking about you all the time usually isn't making it obvious. He isn't trying to impress you every second. He isn't constantly giving compliments or dropping hints about his feelings. Instead, he keeps things looking relaxed while showing tiny behaviors that seem meaningless on the surface. Small habits, quiet moments, little reactions he probably doesn't even notice himself. Those are often the things that reveal you're living in his mind far more than he's willing to admit. A lot of women believe that if they're constantly on a man's mind, he'll naturally make it clear, he'll show more interest, he'll chase harder, he'll find obvious ways to prove it. But that's not always how it happens in real life. The men who think about someone the most often hide it the best. They purposely act calm. They try to keep every conversation feeling normal. Not because they're playing games, but because letting someone know they're thinking about them non-stop feels incredibly vulnerable. It means showing feelings before they know whether those feelings are safe. That can feel risky. Think about the way men describe these experiences after enough time has passed. They rarely say, "I made sure she knew I couldn't stop thinking about her." Instead, they admit things like, "I tried to play it cool even though she was always on my mind," or "I didn't want her to realize how much space she was taking up in my head," or "I thought about her constantly, but I acted like it wasn't a big deal." That's because these thoughts happen quietly. They're internal. And when they become strong, many guys work even harder to hide them. So the 9 behaviors we're about to explore aren't loud or dramatic. They're not designed to make you feel special. In fact, some might even convince you that he's less interested than he really is. But these are often the real clues, the subtle ones. The behaviors that quietly reveal what's happening inside when someone occupies much more of his thoughts than he ever expected. If you've been wondering whether you're actually on this guy's mind, if he seems interested one moment and completely casual the next, if you can't tell whether you're important to him or just another friend he enjoys seeing, keep paying attention. What comes next isn't about the words he chooses. It's about the habits he can't fully control, those automatic moments that quietly expose how often you're crossing his mind without him meaning to. Before looking at those behaviors, it's important to understand what being on someone's mind really means, because this is where many people misunderstand the whole situation. Being on a person's mind isn't exactly the same as attraction. It isn't just thinking someone looks good or enjoying their company. It's something deeper. It's when they begin appearing in your thoughts for no obvious reason. You're driving home, and they pop into your head. You're standing in line at the grocery store, and suddenly you remember something they said. You're watching a random movie, hearing a song, walking through a park, and somehow your mind connects it back to them. That isn't something most people choose. It simply starts happening. Most guys can handle having a crush. They know how to flirt. They know how to ask someone out. They know how to keep conversations fun. But when someone starts living in their thoughts every day without trying, that's a different experience altogether. It catches them off guard. And because they don't fully understand it themselves, they often behave in strange little ways without realizing it. Many won't even admit what's happening until much later. They'll tell themselves it's nothing serious. They'll tell friends it's just casual. They'll convince themselves they're overthinking it. Because admitting that someone is constantly on your mind also means admitting the person's opinion suddenly matters. Their messages matter, their attention matters, their absence matters. And that level of emotional exposure can feel uncomfortable until they're confident the feelings might be returned. That's why the behaviors we're talking about aren't carefully planned. They're the little things that slip through the cracks while he's trying his best to appear calm. Those tiny moments often tell a much bigger story than anything he actually says. The first sign is surprisingly simple. He remembers random things you mentioned weeks ago and brings them up as though it's completely normal, not major life events. Not huge emotional conversations, tiny details. Maybe you casually mentioned a difficult coworker. Maybe you told a funny story from childhood. Maybe you laughed about something embarrassing that happened one afternoon. You barely remember saying it. Yet weeks later, he casually asks how that coworker is doing or references that old story as if it happened yesterday. There's a reason this stands out. When someone isn't occupying much space in your mind, you naturally forget most of the little details they share. You listen in the moment, then your attention moves on. But when someone keeps appearing in your thoughts long after conversations end, your brain starts holding on to the smallest pieces without effort. Suddenly, random comments become memorable. Ordinary stories stay fresh, tiny details refuse to disappear. And when he casually brings those details back into conversation without realizing how unusual that is, it often reveals that you've been crossing his mind far more often than he ever intended. You might think it's just a good memory. Sometimes it is. But when those forgotten little moments keep showing up naturally, they often point towards something much deeper happening behind the scene. And trust me, what happens next becomes even more interesting. He'll casually ask about that problem with your car that you mentioned a couple of weeks ago. He'll remember your friend's name from a single conversation. He'll bring up something you told him a long time ago as if you only talked about it yesterday. Most people assume that's just because he's a good listener. But there's a difference. A good listener pays attention while you're speaking. This goes beyond that. His mind quietly stores little pieces of information because, without realizing it, you've become important to him. He's not trying to earn points by remembering. It simply happens on its own. When someone stays in your thoughts, even the smallest details they share begin to stick. Notice how naturally he brings these things up. He doesn't stop to say, "See, I remembered." He just slips them into the conversation like anyone would remember. He might casually ask, "So, did everything work out with your sister? Or how did that appointment finally go?" Meanwhile, you're wondering how he could possibly remember something you barely recalled telling him yourself. That's the clue. He's not keeping mental notes on purpose. His mind just keeps coming back to you, so the details stay there too. Little moments become lasting memories because somewhere without even planning it, you've become someone his brain keeps returning to. Keep watching, because the next sign becomes even easier to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. Another quiet sign appears when you mention other guys. He stays calm on the outside, almost too calm. He doesn't suddenly become jealous. He doesn't interrupt you or start acting strange. He doesn't fire off a bunch of questions or try to change the topic. Instead, something very subtle changes. His attention sharpens. He becomes just a little quieter. His focus shifts ever so slightly, even if his expression hardly changes. You can almost feel the difference before you can explain it. Here's why. If you're not taking up much space in his thoughts, hearing about another guy barely means anything. It's just another part of the conversation. But when you're already living in his mind, those details suddenly matter. Not because he wants to control you, not because he's trying to compete. It's because a small part of him instantly wonders whether this person could change what's happening between the two of you. His mind quietly starts putting pieces together. Is this someone important? Is there something I should know? That's why his energy shifts, even if only for a moment. Pay attention to what happens right after you bring another guy up. Does he casually ask one simple question that seems harmless but quietly checks the situation? Does he make a light joke that feels slightly more personal than usual? Does he pause for a second before smiling and continuing the conversation like nothing happened? Those tiny reactions aren't always intentional. They're often signs that the information actually matters to him, even while he's trying hard to act completely relaxed. That's what it looks like when someone occupies more of his thoughts than he's comfortable admitting. Another behavior shows up when conversations should naturally be over, yet somehow they continue for just a little longer. He doesn't make it awkward. He doesn't desperately search for anything to say. Instead, just as the moment is ending, another question appears. Another random thought pops into his head. Another small story somehow finds its way into the conversation. It feels effortless, almost accidental, but there's usually more behind it. Think about how conversations normally work. When someone isn't on your mind very much, saying goodbye feels easy. The conversation ends. Both people move on with their day, and that's that. But when someone has been filling your thoughts, ending the conversation suddenly feels disappointing. You aren't ready for the connection to disappear yet, so he quietly stretches the moment. He'll say, "Oh, one more thing," or "before you head out," or "I almost forgot to ask you something." Not because those words absolutely needed to be said, but because he's not quite ready to let the interaction end. The same pattern appears through messages. You're both clearly finished texting. Everything feels complete. Then several minutes later, another message arrives about something completely random. Maybe it's a funny thought. Maybe it's something he just remembered. Maybe it's a picture that suddenly made him think of you. The conversation had already ended, yet somehow it starts again. In person, he might walk beside you a little farther than necessary, stand near your car for another minute, or keep talking while neither of you is actually. These extra moments seem tiny, but together they reveal something important. Spending time with you feels good, and when someone stays in his mind throughout the day, even a few extra minutes together become worth holding on to. There's another quiet clue that often goes unnoticed. He starts including you in future plans without making it feel like some huge conversation. He isn't asking for a serious commitment. He isn't planning months ahead in a dramatic way. Instead, he casually talks about something happening later and naturally speaks as if you'll already be there. Maybe he mentions a new restaurant opening next month and says, "We should check that out." Maybe he talks about a friend's event coming up and automatically includes you in the picture without even stopping to ask whether you'd be interested. It sounds effortless because to him it is. Most people don't realize how meaningful this can be. People usually don't place someone into future plans unless that person is already living somewhere in their thoughts. Even simple plans reveal how the mind is quietly imagining tomorrow. When someone is only casual, there's rarely an automatic assumption they'll still be around. But when you're constantly crossing his mind, imagining future moments with you begins to happen naturally. He's not trying to pressure you. He's not secretly making promises. His mind simply starts seeing you as part of the picture ahead. Listen carefully to the language he uses. He might casually say, "You'll probably love that place when it opens," or "You'd really enjoy this thing I'm doing next month." Notice the confidence behind those words. He's speaking as though seeing you again isn't a question. It's simply the way his mind already expects things to unfold. That expectation often says much more than any direct confession ever could. And believe it or not, the next behavior reveals even more than this one. He already talks as if you're going to be there. He'll casually say things like, "Next time we go," or "When we check that place out," as though another meeting is already expected. Notice what he's doing. He isn't asking whether you'd like to be part of those future moments. He's naturally speaking as if another chapter together is already coming. That's important because people don't usually picture someone in tomorrow unless that person is already taking up space in today's thoughts. The next quiet sign is something most people never notice. He begins matching your energy without realizing he's doing it. Watch him over time instead of judging one conversation. When you're excited, his excitement slowly rises too. When you're stressed, his mood becomes calmer and more thoughtful. If you're feeling tired, his energy softens without him even thinking about it. None of this is planned. He's not consciously trying to copy you. His emotions simply start moving alongside yours because he's paying closer attention than he even realizes. Here's why that matters. When someone isn't on your mind very often, their emotional state stays separate from yours. You may care, but it doesn't automatically change how you feel. When someone is constantly crossing your mind, something different happens. Their emotions begin affecting your own, so when you're happy, he naturally becomes lighter. When you're disappointed, he becomes more serious without being asked. You'll notice it happen in real time. You could both be laughing one minute, then you suddenly bring up something meaningful, and almost instantly his tone changes with yours. Or maybe you're quietly stressed without saying much at all, yet somehow he notices and adjusts how he talks to you. That's not something people usually do with someone who barely occupies their thoughts. It often happens because they're emotionally tuned in, following your mood almost automatically. Stay with me, because the next behavior becomes even harder to fake. You'll also notice that he behaves just a little differently around you than he does around everyone else, even though he clearly tries not to make it obvious. The difference isn't dramatic. It's hidden inside tiny details. Maybe he chooses his words more carefully when you're listening. Maybe your jokes make him laugh just a little longer than everyone else's. Maybe when you start talking, he naturally gives you more attention than the rest of the group. Perhaps he's usually loud and outgoing, but around you he's calmer and more focused. Or maybe he's quiet with everyone else, but somehow becomes more open when you're nearby. Something feels slightly different, even if it's difficult to explain. Here's why. Once someone starts occupying your thoughts regularly, they stop feeling like everybody else. They become different, more important. That feeling quietly changes behavior, even when you're trying to hide it. So pay attention in group situations. Does he check your reaction before anyone else's? Does he naturally include you in conversations? Does his attention keep drifting back toward you without him realizing it? Those little moments aren't always intentional. They're often the result of someone quietly holding a special place in his mind. He may be trying to act exactly the same with everyone, but the small differences continue showing up because real attention is difficult to disguise for very long. Another powerful clue is that he starts sharing pieces of everyday life with you that most people would never bother mentioning. These aren't huge confessions or dramatic secrets. They're simple things. A funny video he found, a strange conversation that happened at work, a random article he read while scrolling, a song that reminded him of something, a weird moment during his day that made him laugh. Things that aren't important enough to tell everyone, yet somehow he still wants to tell you. That's because when someone isn't taking up much space in your thoughts, you usually save conversations for major updates. But when someone keeps appearing in your mind throughout the day, almost everything starts feeling worth sharing with them. The interesting part is the timing. These messages don't arrive on a schedule. They appear in the middle of the afternoon, late at night, early in the morning, whenever something happens. That's because he isn't planning them. He experiences something, smiles, and your name quietly enters his mind. Without thinking much about it, he reaches for his phone. That automatic desire to include someone in ordinary moments says a lot. It means they aren't only present during special occasions, they're woven into everyday life. And that's exactly what happens when someone stays on your mind far more often than you admit, even to yourself. Then there's one of the strongest signs of all, and it's so quiet that many people completely miss it. He's comfortable with silence when he's with you. Most conversations have awkward pauses where people rush to fill the empty space. They start talking about anything just to avoid the silence. But notice what happens with him. When conversation slows down, does he seem perfectly relaxed? Does he simply enjoy sitting there without forcing new topics? Does the quiet actually feel peaceful instead of uncomfortable? That matters more than most people realize. When you're uneasy around someone, silence feels heavy. You constantly search for words because the empty moments make you nervous. But when someone's presence genuinely matters to you, silence stops feeling like a problem. It becomes part of the connection itself. A man who's thinking about you usually doesn't feel pressure to entertain you every second. He's simply happy sharing the same space. That's a different kind of comfort. It's not built on endless conversation. It's built on enjoying the person's company even when nothing needs to be said. Comfortable silence often reflects trust, ease, and emotional closeness. If he can quietly sit beside you without trying to impress you every minute, that calm feeling may be revealing much more than any long speech ever could. And believe it or not, the final sign brings everything together. The last behavior is one of the clearest because it reveals just how closely he's paying attention. He notices tiny changes that almost everyone else misses, not the obvious ones that anybody would see. The little things, maybe you change the color of your nails, maybe you're wearing a ring you almost never wear, maybe your voice sounds slightly different today, maybe you seem a little more tired than usual. Maybe you use an unusual word or mention something in a different way than normal, and somehow he catches it immediately. Those details seem invisible to most people, yet he notices them because his attention has quietly become much sharper whenever you're around. Here's what that often means. When someone isn't occupying your thoughts, you remember the big picture. You recognize their face, their style, their personality, but many small details slip by unnoticed. When someone is constantly crossing your mind, however, your brain begins storing the little differences too. You don't just recognize them, you learn their patterns. You notice what's changed because you've unconsciously memorized what usually stays the same. That's why those tiny observations matter. They don't necessarily prove love. They don't guarantee a relationship, but they often reveal something simple and powerful. You've been on his mind often enough that his attention naturally became deeper than he ever planned. And sometimes those quiet details tell the biggest story of all. Once someone has paid close attention to you for a long time, even the smallest changes begin to stand out. That's why a man who has you on his mind again and again often notices things that seem almost impossible for anyone else to catch. He's not carefully studying every detail about you. It simply happens because his mind has quietly become familiar with you. Tiny differences naturally stand out. Maybe your voice sounds a little softer today. Maybe you're wearing something you don't usually wear. Maybe you seem slightly more tired, or your smile feels different somehow. The interesting part is how casually he points these things out. He might simply say, "You seem a little tired today," or "Those are new, aren't they?" or "Something feels different today." He isn't trying to impress you by showing how observant he is. He just notices without thinking much about it. That's what happens when someone regularly occupies your thoughts. You become familiar in a way that makes even the smallest changes easy to recognize. People don't usually notice those details about someone they only think about once in a while. That quiet awareness often comes from someone whose attention keeps returning to you long after each conversation has ended. And here's where everything starts coming together. Once you understand these 9 quiet behaviors, you'll never look at someone's actions in quite the same way again. The signs aren't loud, they rarely announce themselves. But together they tell a story that's much harder to ignore. Stay with me, because this changes how you read the entire situation. Imagine someone who spent weeks wondering whether a man liked her because he always acted so relaxed around her. He never seemed overly romantic. He never pushed too hard. Everything felt friendly and easy, which made her believe she was probably just another friend. But after paying closer attention, she started noticing something different. He remembered tiny stories she had forgotten she even told him. Whenever another guy entered the conversation, his energy shifted ever so slightly before returning to normal. Conversations that should have ended somehow kept going because he always found one more thing to ask or one more story to tell. None of these moments were dramatic on their own. In fact, each one seemed almost meaningless, but together they painted a very different picture. They quietly revealed that she had been crossing his mind far more often than he ever admitted. Now picture someone else who believed a man was only keeping things light and casual. She thought there wasn't much happening beneath the surface. Then she realized he constantly spoke about future plans as though she'd naturally be there. Without thinking, he matched her mood almost every time they talked. Around other people he acted one way, yet around her there was always a small difference she couldn't quite explain. He shared funny thoughts, random moments from his day, songs, articles, and little stories that didn't really matter to anyone else. That's when everything finally made sense. She realized those weren't random habits. They were small windows into how often she had been occupying his thoughts while he continued acting completely normal. Sometimes the quietest behaviors tell the biggest truth. Once you recognize these patterns, your focus begins to change. Instead of waiting for huge romantic gestures or obvious confessions, you start noticing the little things that happen over and over again. That's important because people who constantly think about someone rarely make a dramatic announcement. More often, they protect those feelings by acting calm. They keep conversations relaxed. They avoid making everything look serious. If you're only watching for obvious signs, you'll probably miss the ones that matter most. So instead of asking whether he's suddenly chasing harder or becoming more romantic overnight, pay attention to the small habits that quietly repeat themselves. Those patterns usually reveal much more than one impressive moment ever could. Anyone can organize a great date. Anyone can give a sweet compliment now and then. But not everyone remembers a tiny conversation from weeks ago. Not everyone naturally keeps finding reasons to stay a little longer. Not everyone notices little details that almost everyone else overlooks. Those steady, consistent moments often reveal much more than occasional grand gestures. They're difficult to fake because they grow naturally over time, rather than being carefully planned. That's why consistency is far more valuable than intensity when you're trying to understand what someone is really feeling beneath the surface. There's something else worth paying attention to. Notice the behaviors he isn't controlling. Words can be chosen carefully. Plans can be organized. Messages can be written and rewritten before they're sent, but certain reactions happen automatically. He can't easily stop his attention from sharpening when another guy comes up. He can't instantly prevent himself from matching your mood without realizing it. He can't force comfortable silence if he truly feels awkward around you. And he can't always stop himself from naturally placing you inside future conversations. Those are the moments where genuine feelings often appear because they're happening without conscious effort. Another helpful comparison is watching how he treats everyone else. People who constantly think about someone usually behave just a little differently around that person, even when they're trying their best to appear exactly the same.